Each time the alien princess slept, time froze, so he stayed awake forever. They discovered her drifting in space, asleep in a crystal pod that hadn't aged in 1,000 years. The moment her eyes opened, stars began to move again. No one knew why the universe paused when she slept, but one human learned it firsthand. And when she began to fall asleep again, he made a vow no being had ever dared. He would never let her close her eyes, even if it cost him everything. In the farthest fringes of human-charted space, where stars flickered like fading embers in a hearth long forgotten, a salvage crew aboard the long-haul vessel Artemis Gray stumbled upon what they initially assumed was space debris, just another derelict remnant drifting through the gravitational hush of a collapsed binary system. But when their scans pinged back with readings of active stasis fields and energy levels that defied physics, protocol fell away, and curiosity took over. Encased within a translucent crystal cocoon the size of a small shuttle, a figure floated, in suspended animation. Her skin was pale with a soft glow like moonlight through clouds, her silver-laced hair drifting gently around her temple, and her expression locked in a peaceful stillness that suggested she'd been asleep for centuries. The crew debated over what to do, but Elias Vane, the ship's engineer, a man known for quiet integrity and a compulsion to understand the universe's unexplainable pockets, stepped forward, drawn not just by the tech, but by the presence inside. Against the captain's better judgment and under the strictest isolation protocols, Elias began working on deciphering the pod's interface, discovering a language coded in fractal sequences and light pulses. The moment he aligned the final sequence, the pod pulsed once with a soundless shiver and her eyes fluttered open. In that instant, clocks throughout the ship jumped forward 5 seconds, chronometers blinked erratically, and suspended fluids snapped back into motion, because unknown to them, everything around her had been frozen in temporal stasis for who knows how long. Where the pod had been, time itself had ceased to flow. Her name was Celia, though she said it like it was a question she hadn't asked herself in a long time, and her first breath in Elias's presence sent a tremor through the surrounding space. She could barely speak at first, her mind operating on temporal concepts alien to human biology, but with patience, gestures, and the soft cadence of Elias's voice reading from an old Earth novella, she began to respond, not just with understanding, but with a hesitant kind of warmth. The team sent data to Earth, and within hours the entire system was under observation by Terran Command, who dispatched researchers, linguists, and physicists, all of whom missed the one crucial observation Elias made quietly. When she began to tire, when her eyelids fluttered closed and her speech slurred into dreamlike hums, the lights dimmed, the ship slowed, and the stars outside stopped moving. Instruments detected gravitational stalling and atomic resonance freezing in the outer hull. Time itself was decelerating. It was Elias, not the brilliant Dr. Chang or the hawk-eyed military liaison, who grasped the implications. The alien princess wasn't just under a time-affecting stasis. She was the source of it. She didn't control time. She embodied the concept of temporal lock. When she slept, the surrounding universe followed suit, and as her body, long unaccustomed to wakefulness, began to crave sleep again, the station itself began to glitch. Gravity pulses misfired, power systems rebooted without input, and life support ran milliseconds out of sync. When she collapsed into unconsciousness one afternoon, the station's clock stalled and the crew experienced what was later described as standing inside a paused film. Some swore they felt their hearts hesitate. Elias alone, who had been holding her hand at the moment of her slumber, could still move, speak, breathe, as if the act of caring had tethered him outside her stasis bubble. It became clear, if she slept, time froze, and the only one who could keep her awake was him. And so began Elias's vigil. He set alarms to blink at random intervals, read to her until his voice cracked, and created crude simulations with the ship's VR deck to stimulate her mind with new experiences. Flowers blooming, dogs barking, waves crashing, all piped into her neural interface. Celia, still adjusting to the idea of human companionship, asked strange questions about death, loneliness, and why humans cried over music. Her questions didn't come from curiosity, they came from necessity. Emotion, Elias learned, was the only thing strong enough to stir her mind out of its biological instinct to rest. She had been bred, perhaps unwillingly, by an extinct race of time engineers who needed a living lock to preserve their final hours, and now she was cursed with the side effect: eternal consciousness at the cost of cosmic continuity. Elias didn't tell her this. He didn't tell anyone. Instead, he asked her to describe her favorite color. He taught her chess and told stories about childhood on Mars Colony 3, where gravity was light enough to feel like dreams. He smiled when she smiled, even though his face had aged more in those first 7 days than in the past 3 years. Celia began to laugh sometimes, soft musical notes like water in a cracked bowl, and each time the surrounding stars twinkled in rhythm, as if the universe approved. But exhaustion soon made a home in Elias's bones. His body, held together by caffeine patches and intravenous nutrient tubes, started to rebel. His hands shook when pouring water, and hallucinations whispered from the corners of his eyes. But still he read. Still he talked. Because in the back of his mind a fear greater than death took root. The fear that if she ever fully slipped back into sleep, he might lose her forever, or worse, condemn the universe to an endless pause where no life could ever evolve again. The scientists didn't know how to help. They debated, argued, and eventually tried stimulating her brain with artificial neural patterns. It worked for 30 seconds. Then she convulsed and nearly died. Elias sat with her in the infirmary, afterward holding her hand, whispering things that made no sense until her fingers twitched and her eyes fluttered back open. She smiled and said, "You make time feel warm." He didn't cry then, though he wanted to. Instead, he nodded and made another promise: to keep her safe, no matter what the cost, no matter what sleep would demand of them both. Because in a universe where gods could sleep and stop existence, Elias had chosen to become the one man who would never let that happen. Not out of duty, not even out of love, but because he couldn't bear to live in a cosmos where she didn't wake up, smiling beside him. Sleep was once a simple thing for Elias, an act of rest, a surrender to trust in the universe's consistency. But now it was the most dangerous luxury he could never afford, not while the alien princess's eyes fluttered with fatigue and the surrounding universe held its breath with each blink she dared. For days that stretched into weeks, Elias lived in fragments of awareness, sipping synthetic stimulant packs, absorbing radiation exposure from emergency lamps, and anchoring himself to her fading consciousness with every ounce of empathy and endurance his human body could muster. Celia, the alien princess born from a culture long gone, had begun to understand the nature of her curse, though Elias had spared her the full truth. She recognized that every time her body gave in to slumber, the lights dimmed unnaturally. Systems lagged, and her surroundings seemed to sigh into paralysis. She felt it in the metallic echo of her heartbeat, in the way even sound softened around her, like a universe too afraid to disturb her dreams. She began to fight it, the way a child fights gravity while learning to walk, stumbling mentally through moments of emotional whiplash and alien confusion. But it was Elias who bore the worst of it, because with each night she stayed awake, her dependency on him deepened, and the burden of keeping her mind engaged became a ticking psychological time bomb he could hear in the hissing of coolant vents. Command back on Earth, observing via delayed quantum relays, demanded regular updates and issued orders to sedate her, to put her back in stasis, to quarantine what they no longer understood. But Elias ignored them. He disabled the transmitter, telling no one. To them, she was a threat to temporal integrity. To him, she was a living being caught in a prison her body didn't choose. It was during one of these long vigils, when both of them were swaying on the edge of unconsciousness, that she asked the question that shattered what little stability remained. What happens to you if I sleep? The silence that followed was more brutal than any vacuum. Elias hesitated, then finally said, "You stop everything, except me, and I don't know why." Her eyes, luminous and endless, narrowed with pain rather than confusion. She whispered, "Then I am not just a danger. I am your sentence. And for the first time, Celia cried. Not dramatically, not with sobs, but with slow, silent streaks of moisture down her porcelain cheeks. And as those tears touched her skin, the ship itself groaned. The outer rings of the nearby planet, visible through the viewport, wobbled unnaturally. Instruments shrieked. Elias rushed to her, hands cradling her face, whispering nonsense, fairy tales, verses from long-dead poets, just to coax a smile from her lips again. And it worked. Barely. The distortion halted, but the truth was laid bare. Her emotions did not just tether time, they commanded it. Grief warped space. Peace stabilized it. Laughter could restart time's rhythm. The implications were bigger than either of them could articulate, but neither cared anymore. They were beyond mission parameters, beyond salvage teams, beyond diplomacy. In the solitude of deep space, Elias and Celia had become something sacred, two conscious beings defying entropy with a fragile tether of mutual resilience. She began to ask him for more stories, ones with happy endings. So he invented them, hundreds of them. Entire civilizations conjured from memory and imagination, lovers who overcame interstellar distance, animals who reunited with their lost cubs, children who grew up to find purpose. Every narrative became a lifeline she clung to. But even Elias couldn't sustain the effort forever. His hands trembled constantly now. His sleep-deprived hallucinations intensified. Once he saw his mother's face in the cargo bay vent and wept for an hour. Another time he caught himself trying to explain to a wall panel why love was stronger than physics. He knew he was degrading, not just physically but mentally, and there was only one way to reset. One evening, as Celia hummed to herself beside the energy panels, an alien tune that made the fabric of space thrum softly, Elias looked at her and said, "What if I could make it night for everyone, not just you?" She turned slowly, the question hanging like dew on a fragile thread. "What do you mean?" He showed her the calculations, wild, desperate math stitched together from scraps of old starship field theories and quantum damping modules. It was insane, dangerous, but in theory it was possible to deploy a global satellite grid around Earth and its colonies that filtered out the visible spectrum, effectively casting the entire human domain in a programmable artificial night. A lie of darkness to keep her safe. "But why?" she whispered. "Because you need rest, and I need to know I'm not just delaying the inevitable." She stared at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then she said, "That is the most beautiful lie I've ever heard." With that, Elias began planning. He reached out to his contacts, using old smugglers' codes, friends who owed him favors, rogue engineers and decommissioned AI constructs, who remembered him from the asteroid belt wars. Piece by piece he built the framework, not to contain her, but to build a world where she didn't have to suffer alone in eternal wakefulness. And all the while, Celia began to change. Not just emotionally. Her biology adapted. The longer she stayed conscious, the more human rhythms she adopted. She laughed more easily. She felt cold. She craved texture, asked for fabrics, tastes, smells. Elias introduced her to coffee, which she detested, and oranges, which made her cry from joy. But the greatest shift came one night when she leaned her head against his shoulder and said softly, "I don't want to stop the stars anymore. I want to dance under them." Elias held her then, knowing full well the weight of her words. It meant the plan had to succeed. And so, as the Artemis Gray slipped back into Terran orbit, hidden behind lunar shadow, Elias activated the signal array, one he'd designed without military knowledge. With a cascading pulse across all major satellite networks, Earth's skies dimmed. Not blackness, just a soft global twilight that simulated dusk, cloaking her presence in a permanent half-light where she could rest without pausing the universe. He didn't ask for permission. He just gave her the night. The response from Earth was chaos, but the system held. Panic faded into adaptation. They called it the dim hour, a new phenomenon blamed on solar fluctuations. Governments postured, scientists scrambled for answers, but none knew the truth, that the alien princess had finally slept, and the world had kept turning. Elias collapsed the moment it worked, sleep hitting him like gravity he had denied too long. He awoke in medical, pale and trembling, and found Celia waiting beside him, a faint smile on her lips, her hand warm around his. "I dreamed," she said, "of you, under a real sky." And for the first time, he let himself believe in a future where she didn't have to carry the weight of time alone, and he didn't have to suffer to hold her steady. In the soft hum of the ship, surrounded by artificial twilight, two broken creatures began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could teach the stars to move again, not through force or fear, but through the quiet revolution of kindness and the decision to never give up on each other. The skies above Terra Station 12 remained perpetually blanketed in a steel-gray hue, as if even the universe itself held its breath. With every passing moment, the alien princess teetered on the edge of unconsciousness, and for Jason, every second, without her voice, her gaze, her presence, was a prelude to the freezing grip of halted time. He had learned this now not just as scientific fact, but as a brutal truth engraved into the rhythm of his own body, a rhythm now fraying from the edges, as fatigue clawed at his eyes and muscles with unrelenting force. He had stayed awake for nearly 3 days, subsisting on high-grade stim patches and synthetic adrenaline, trying everything he could to delay the inevitable moment when the alien princess's eyelids would flutter shut and reality itself would fall into paralysis. The flow of seconds arrested like a dying watch submerged in ice, for when she slept, clocks stopped ticking, engines ceased whirring, and even the rotation of planets halted, suspended in some cruel, uncharted law of physics, or divine irony, one tethered to the fragile form of a girl not of this world. And though the scientists and engineers of the Terran Union had deemed her a cosmic anomaly, a threat perhaps, Jason knew her differently, saw her not as a risk to temporal fabric, but as a person, gentle, frightened, and utterly alone, her pale, lavender eyes dimming with each cycle as the pressure of existence weighed heavier upon her slim shoulders, the burden of guilt gnawing at her because she knew her sleep meant devastation, meant families frozen mid-embrace, meant systems locking down, meant a universe paused, inert, dead until her lashes lifted once more. So she tried to stay awake, with him, tried to match his endurance though her physiology wasn't designed for such exertion, and in quiet moments huddled in the utility bay's ambient lighting, she whispered things to him about her world, her people, how she had been born into a royal caste that had long since abandoned emotions, but somehow she had been different. Born flawed, they said, because her heart felt too much. Her tears were not filtered for diplomacy, but were raw, vulnerable, and that maybe, just maybe, that's why time had bound itself to her, reacting to a soul so paradoxical it defied the clockwork march of causality. And Jason, who once believed in nothing more than logic and mission directives, now clung to her every word as if each syllable were a heartbeat he could lend her, holding her close when her breath grew shallow, distracting her with stories from Earth, of rain on cobbled streets, of jazz music played on corners, of dogs that barked for no reason but joy, things she'd never known, never tasted, and when she smiled, it ignited something fierce and warm in him, something that refused to accept that her existence could only come at the price of universal inertia. The station had now fallen under lockdown from command, the outer corridors sealed to contain what they called a chronosynthetic anomaly, and they wanted her transported to the deep core research vaults on Titan, where they could sedate her, lock her away, study her in frozen loops. Jason read the directive 3 times before crumpling the tablet and tossing it into the waste chute, his heart pounding with fury, with dread, because he knew that sedation meant permanent stasis, that they would never let her wake again if it threatened causality. And in the dim hum of the maintenance deck he made his choice, a decision wild and treasonous. He would not let them take her. He would run, and with the help of Margot, the aged engineer who had once taught him how to steal power from emergency cores, they initiated a fake meltdown drill, long enough to mask their escape through the emergency vent tunnels and to the external shuttle bay. But every second was a gamble because as the alien princess grew wearier, her strength drained from within, the energy required to hold herself awake eclipsing what her body could endure. And in one terrifying moment, just as Jason hot-wired the shuttle ignition, she began to slip, her eyes drooping, breath slowing. And as her hand slackened in his, he felt the air go still, saw the flickering shuttle lights freeze mid-pulse, even heard the silence of halted time press against his eardrums like static. And it was only by sheer desperation, by the scream he let out, that she flinched awake again, reversing the tide, restarting everything in a violent whoosh as systems resumed. Alarms blared anew, and he scooped her into his arms and fired the launch thrusters, bursting through the magnetic hangar veil into the emptiness of space, alone now, fugitives of a collapsing cause and effect universe, with nowhere to go but the edge of mapped sectors in the hope that somewhere, in the unknown, was a planet with enough atmospheric shielding, a place she could finally rest without stopping time, a place where they could live not as aberrations but as people, as partners in survival, and something deeper still. And even, as the stars streaked past the cockpit window, Jason didn't dare blink, didn't dare sleep, and whispered to her as she leaned weakly on his shoulder, "I'll stay awake. Just a little longer." The cold stretch of deep space wrapped around the stolen shuttle like a silent noose as Jason guided the vessel farther beyond the charts, the stars growing thinner and stranger, light warped and drawn into spirals as they drifted into regions unnamed. And beside him, the alien princess lay curled in the passenger seat, her breathing shallow and irregular, her violet skin dim to a dusky hue that made every flicker of movement feel like a countdown to the inevitable. Because no stimulant or whispered promise could keep her awake forever, and both of them knew that even the most stubborn love, the fiercest will, eventually bowed to biology. For 3 more days they floated through forgotten sectors, evading Terran patrols and tracing old smuggler trails. Jason fighting sleep like a man drowning, chewing stim pills like candy, holding her hand as if the warmth could ground her to wakefulness. But each time she blinked longer than before, each pause between her answers, each moment her head drifted to his shoulder, he felt the universe tightening like a knot behind them, poised for another freeze. Until at last, with a flicker of her silver lashes and a final exhausted sigh, the alien princess succumbed to sleep. And as Jason cried out her name, shaking her gently, the moment snapped. Silence poured through the shuttle. Stars outside froze mid-glimmer. Even the onboard oxygen particles seemed to still. And Jason, still conscious by some unknown miracle, felt the weight of an entire paused cosmos press upon his chest, like gravity from another dimension. But unlike the earlier freezes, this one didn't reverse, not in seconds, not in minutes. And as hours crawled past in utter stasis, Jason realized this was different. Not a temporary pause, but a final collapse of time's flow in reaction to her complete physiological shutdown. Panic bloomed in his throat, but he forced it down, cradling her gently in his arms, and began whispering to her about the earth she'd never seen, about sunlight through spring leaves, about his childhood in the hills of Vermont, about the dog he once rescued during a flood, the first girl who kissed him, the dreams he never said aloud. And though time did not move, Jason kept speaking, because words, he decided, could still live even in a frozen world. And maybe, just maybe, they could reach into whatever dimension her consciousness now floated within. Eventually, driven by desperation and dwindling power reserves, he remembered an old gravitational anomaly mapped decades ago, a quantum storm cloud orbiting a rogue planet with irregular physics. It was called Caldra's Fold, a place too unstable for colonization but rumored to house pockets of time inversion fields, where gravity and temporality bent unpredictably. If there was any place in the universe where the alien princess might sleep without stopping the cosmos, it was there. So Jason rerouted the backup nav beacon manually, linked the thrusters to pulse on kinetic cycles rather than time, and guided the shuttle through the frozen stars toward the storm. The journey took 6 real-time days, though to the galaxy no time passed at all, and when they finally breached the swirling gases of Caldra's Fold, the shuttle systems flickered with resistance, lights stuttering between dimensions, but within, The storm's eye, Jason saw something impossible. A moon-shaped station, long abandoned but still emitting trace power, floating in the eye of the chaos, and somehow untouched by the princess's condition. A space where temporal rules were so fragmented they resisted even her anomaly. Landing the shuttle with failing systems and exhausted hands, Jason carried her across the cracked threshold of the station, his legs trembling not just with fatigue, but with the knowledge that this was his last gamble, that if it didn't work, she might never wake again, or worse, never be allowed to, entombed in stillness while the universe moved on without her. Inside the station, a single room still functioned, its walls made of reflective black glass humming faintly, and Jason laid her gently within the chamber, connected her vitals to the remaining med systems, and for the first time in over 2 weeks he allowed himself to sit, to breathe, to close his eyes. Only for a second, he told himself. But when he woke, it wasn't to silence or stillness, but to the gentle pressure of fingers brushing his cheek and a soft voice whispering, "Jason, you're awake." And when he opened his eyes, the alien princess was sitting upright, her expression calm and glowing with color. And outside the station, the stars pulsed slowly, steadily. Time had resumed. Something in Caldra's fold had decoupled her anomaly from linear causality, like a storm canceling another storm. And now, for the first time, she could sleep, could live without consequence. And she wept then, real tears that fell without, quaking planets, sobs that meant nothing to physics but everything to them, and Jason held her as the universe breathed around them again, neither of them needing words to know what they had just survived. They stayed in the fold for weeks, converting the station into a small sanctuary, safe from time's judgment, and eventually, using comm relays long thought obsolete, Jason sent a message, not to command, but to the people who still believed. In miracles, in compassion, in understanding. The story of a girl who once made time kneel, and a man who stayed awake to give her peace. And the galaxy listened, because even in its cold expanse, it still remembered how to hope.